Welcome to Reasoning Through the Bible. My name's Glenn, and this is Steve. Today we're going to start the book of Esther with our verse-by-verse Bible study through the Word of God. What we do here on our program is we go through verse by verse, and as we go along, we try to explain the text and then also introduce some theological topics and some answers to questions that you may have. In today's book, we're going to deal with the Old Testament book of Esther. So a little bit about Esther and what the book is. Before we really start going verse by verse, we'll do a bit of an introduction. In Esther, we have the story of this woman that the book is named for, Esther, and she becomes the queen and ultimately saves the Jewish people, of which she's part of. So it's a very interesting story. It's a very dramatic story in a sense because the people of Israel, the Jewish people, are threatened with extinction in this book, and Esther is put into a unique position to save her. And so there's some very interesting, unique things about this book, Steve. And so I'm going to really be anxious to get into it.
Yeah, this book is some of a love story. We went through Ruth earlier, and that was a love story talking about the kinsman redeemer, and that was kept within the Jewish context of a Moabite girl who married an Israelite man. This is a story where it's an Israelite girl that's going to marry a Persian man, and it's a love story in itself, but it's also one of God's providence and how God protected his people from a great, great harm.
The book of Esther is one of the two books in the Bible that are named for women. There's Esther and one more. Steve, do you remember we covered the other book that was named after a woman? Do you remember which one it is?
Yeah, it's Ruth.
It was Ruth. So Ruth and Esther are the two books named after women. And we're going to see Esther is put into a very interesting position, a very unique position. And she's put into a bit of a risk on what she should do. But she steps up and is brave and manages to do God's will. So we're going to learn some things about what to do in trying circumstances and when we should get involved in issues that might involve the government or moral issues, things like that. All that's here. There's several interesting things about the book of Esther. It's one book in the Bible that does not mention the name of God or the word God at all. It also doesn't mention prayer at all. So we have here a book in the Bible that does not mention God, does not mention prayer, but yet we see God's hand moving throughout the entire book.
Yeah, and it's going to be a great threat against the Israelites in that we have the antagonist, Haman, who he's going to want to wipe out the Jewish people altogether and want to completely annihilate them to where there's nothing there. So it's going to take something really great in order to keep that from happening. So we have some palace intrigue that goes in here. It's like this story kind of has everything that a major motion picture would have. The threat of the annihilation of ethnicity of people, the palace intrigue, how God is working through the different people in order to have them come about to save the Jewish people. And then we also have a Jewish holiday that comes out of this in the very end.
Yes, it's the origin of one of the Jewish holidays. We'll have to hang on to find out what that is. But let's talk about the major themes of the book before we jump right in. There's 4 or 5 major themes that we're going to find in this book of Esther. The first one and the main one we've already hinted at, which is there's an idea that's been taught in church history called providence. Providence. In fact, it's a doctrine of God's providence. And providence, the root word there is just to provide. And the doctrine of God's providence just means that God will provide for his people. He will provide a way to accomplish his will. He provides things in his creation that will get his will done. So the doctrine of the providence of God means that God works things out to accomplish his will, and he works it out through causing things to happen in nature, causing things to happen in people. That's one of the main things that we find here is God's providence. As we mentioned, the people, none of the people in the story of Esther turn to God in prayer. They don't go to God and ask for guidance. At no point do they ever say, "Oh God, please save us." So in that sense, they're out of the will of God in that sense, because they should be, and they're not. So nevertheless, God's hand can be seen throughout the entire book. God arranges circumstances. In fact, Steve, we're probably going to be getting tired of saying, what a coincidence, because all through here, there's these coincidences that are not really coincidences at all. It's God arranging things and arranging the chess pieces on the chessboard to accomplish his purposes. So one of the main themes we see in the book of Esther is the providence of God, and it's throughout this book. There's circumstance after circumstance after circumstance that has God arranging things for people to do things that all align towards the singular purpose of saving his people.
I like how you've put it in other books that we've studied. You say that it's God moving the chess pieces through the free will acts of people, and we see that all throughout this book.
When we talk about God's providence, and you mentioned free will, so that comes into play here. What we're not saying is that God works through people like we are mere instruments. You know, a carpenter might have a saw or a hammer or a screwdriver or some tool, and God could use an instrument like that to use, say, a storm or to use something in nature. That would be an instrument of God. But people are very different from natural forces. People have free will. So what we see here is a series of free will actions by people that, even though they make these decisions and these actions totally free and of their own agency, that's one of the terms the philosophers use, is that we have agency, which means we can decide to do things of our own. We can originate a cause of our own because we have the capacity to originate causes. So we have agency. We have the ability to make decisions and do things, but God uses that and he works through it to accomplish his will. One of the examples I always think of is over in the New Testament. It says that God accomplished his will of getting Jesus crucified on the cross, but he did so through the pagans, Pilate and Herod. And Pilate and Herod were making free will decisions to do something that God had determined to accomplish through all of history, which was that Jesus would die on the cross. So in Esther, we see, for example, towards the beginning of the book, there's a Queen Vashti, and she makes a decision to basically gets herself fired. And so that free will decision brings an opportunity for the king to choose a new queen. And he just happens to choose Esther. And of course, there's at least two free will decisions that God was working through to accomplish his will. So moving Esther in was the providence of God, but he did it through the free will decisions of the king and the queen. So that's the providential hand of God that's moving things around. And again, people are not just tools. They're not just instruments. We are free will agents that make free will decisions that God uses in his grand plan. So that's one of the major purposes. And again, throughout the book, over and over and over again, we see God's providence at work here. The nature of humans is to make free will decisions. So God works through the nature of the thing, which in our case is our free will decision. Another major theme, a second major theme that we have in this book is called preservation. God preserves his people. God will preserve his chosen people. God preserves them and he protects them, even if they're in disobedience. So Steve, we have this people here, this people of Israel that have disobeyed as a nation, So they've been taken captive, and they're in Babylon, and Babylon was taken over by Persia. So they're in a place where they're really in the judgment of God. They had an opportunity to go back to Israel with the first return, and they didn't. So in that sense, they're under the judgment of God in a sense, and they're not necessarily following God's ways. Nevertheless, God preserves his people. And so one of the themes here is that God preserves them even when they're disobedient.
Yeah, it's similar to whenever they were in Egypt. He was preserving the people, his people, while they were in Egypt. And through that whole 400 years that they were there, we saw that they went in as a fairly small family of Jacob and his family. And when they come out 400 years later, they're close to 2 million people. So while they're there, God is taking care of them, and he provides for them so that they come out a nation. They go in a family, they come out a nation. Here in Esther, we see them, as you pointed out, there have been returns coming back from Babylon. Esther takes place between the two returns, and these people have stayed there, yet God is going to protect them and provide for them.
Many teachers point out the fact that Israel as a country, as a people group, didn't follow Jesus. They didn't put faith in Christ. So therefore, God moved on to the church. And okay, no argument there. But yes, Israel as a nation is in disobedience because of their non-belief in Jesus. My question is, point to me a time when they were ever in obedience. And as we see here in Esther, this is just one in a long, long string of instances where the nation of Israel was in total rebellion, total unbelief on God. Nowhere in this book do they ever pray to God and ask for his protection and guidance. Yet God says, because of my name, I will protect you. And so we see here God's preservation. The same thing happens in Ezekiel 36. The same thing happens over and over again in Exodus. As we saw, they're wandering in the wilderness in disbelief, yet God preserves and protects his people, not because of anything good in them. He does it because he had chosen them, and he protects them because he wanted to. That's what we see here. God has a person in just the right place in Esther. He preserves them by, again, this providence. He arranges things. Think, Steve, in this story, for those of you that are somewhat familiar with the story, at one point, the king issues a command to kill all the Jews. And if that would have gone out, it would have annihilated the Jewish race. But nevertheless, put yourselves in the shoe of like the average Jewish person out in one of the provinces. Oh my goodness, the king has declared all of us to be executed. The sky's going to fall. No. God had somebody in just the right place at just the right time that's going to influence the heart of the king, and he's going to change the circumstances. Why? Because of his providence and because he protects his people. And so that's what we see here, is that God protects his people through his hand of providence, and he's working in the background to accomplish his will. And it's just a wonderful story.
Yeah, and we also see that over in Daniel, we see the pattern in Daniel as well as in Esther, and we also saw it in Nehemiah, where outside forces go to the king to get the king to give a decree to stop work in Ezra and Nehemiah's situation. In Daniel, it's so that they would go and worship Nebuchadnezzar, and if they didn't worship Nebuchadnezzar, that they would be killed. And that was a plot against Daniel and his friends in order to end up killing them. We see that here now. The king is being manipulated by an outside force in order to be used to annihilate all the Jewish people here in Esther. In these other books, it's a portion of the people. But in this particular book, it's every Jew altogether. They want to be them annihilated all throughout wherever Persia was in command.
Back to the major themes in the book. We have God's providence, we have God's preservation, and the third one is seizing divine opportunities to change society. Seizing divine opportunities to change society. And for those of you that know the story, at one point, again, the king had put out this proclamation to kill the Jews. And the two main characters, Mordecai and Esther, see an opportunity to get involved in the government with the king that would change society. But it's a risk. It could have cost Esther her life. Mordecai at one point tells her, "How do you know whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" And that's a key verse. That's in Esther 4:14. Who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? That's a question that each of us should ask ourselves, those of us that are children of God. How do we know that God didn't put us in this unique position for such a time as this? Therefore, it may be a risk, but Esther stepped out at the risk of her own life, and it ended up changing the course of history and protecting her people and accomplishing God's will. So there's an opportunity that she has to change society by bringing in biblical concepts in a key spot. So that's one of the themes. And related to that one is the next one, being involved in government for a moral cause. Being involved in government for a moral cause. Esther became involved in a secular government, and doing so fulfilled God's purposes to save his people. And so she didn't shy away and say, oh, well, that's just politics. No. This isn't political parties. This is a moral issue. This is a moral issue because people were going to be executed unjustly. And so she was in a position to step in and say, no, I'm going to get involved with secular government for a moral cause. And so this isn't politics, it's a moral issue. She could have sat back and said, well, too bad, so sad, not supposed to be involved in politics. No. God put her there for such a time as this. So she, through risk of her own, got involved in secular government for a moral cause, and it ended up accomplishing God's will and ended up helping with moral things. And then lastly, the theme I had, Steve, was average women can do great things. Average women can do great things. Esther starts out here as just an average woman. She's an unknown face in the crowd until God has an opportunity and steps up and she gets chosen. So an average woman can do great things when God has its hand in it. And so I'm ready for this study, Steve. I think it's going to be a great one. So tell us a little bit about some of the history and background of where this fits.
Yeah, we have a chart here that we can show if we want to flip to that, and I'll describe it for our listeners. We'll put this chart up on our resources page that people that want to use it for their classes and studies can do that. But it's broken into three areas. The top part shows the Persian kings throughout this time frame here. The middle part shows the three books that are usually put together of Ezra, Esther, and Nehemiah that take place during these Persian kings. And we just got through doing a study of Nehemiah. We're doing Esther. At some point, we'll do Ezra. And then the bottom one there gives some of the prophets that are operating during this time. So just going back up to the top, we had the first king there, Persian King Cyrus. He's the one, and Darius, that gave the decree for the Jewish people to go back and rebuild their temple. And so we saw that first return by Zerubbabel, and he went back and took a group of people to go start the temple. And that's all described in the book of Ezra. We see through that book of Ezra that was put on hold by going to the king and a decree put there. In the middle part, we have Esther, which is taking place during the time of Ahasuerus or Xerxes. Xerxes, by the way, out of curiosity, he's the one that is involved with an invasion into Greece. So Greece was having issues with Persia, and there was a Greco-Persian war that had been going on for several decades. And Xerxes is the one that was leading the Persians, an army of somewhere between 120,000 to 300,000 at the famous Battle of Thermopylae. where Leonidas, the great Greek general, held off the Persians at the pass there at Thermopylae. And so that's Xerxes. That's this particular Persian king that was involved in that battle. And it's during this time where Esther takes place. If we're going back to the chart, we then move into Artaxerxes, and Artaxerxes was the Persian king, as the son of Xerxes, that was ruling at the time of Nehemiah. And during Nehemiah, that was the third return from exile that took place with Nehemiah. And so we have these returns that are depicted in Ezra, Esther, and Nehemiah. Esther is in the middle in the time frame, roughly around 483 to 473 BC. And then at the very end of that, we go into what's called the 400 years of silence, where we don't really have any prophets or anything else, anybody else that's dealing with Israel. We don't have any recorded history from a biblical standpoint that's there. But Esther is taking place in between Ezra and Nehemiah at the time whenever Jerusalem, the temple is being rebuilt, the walls of Jerusalem are being rebuilt, and Esther's kind of in the whole middle of that. And it ends up that God is preserving the Jewish people through Esther.
So from a big picture, my takeaway with all of that is this: where Esther fits in the grand scheme of history is after the entire period of the kings. If you think of the books of Kings and Chronicles, after all of that, God sends in Babylon in judgment, takes them away for 70 years. At the end of that 70 years, there was several returns back to the land. Esther happens in that period. The people in Persia at the time of Esther, and this is kind of the key takeaway for me, the people in Esther were Jewish people that had an opportunity to go back to the land, but had not taken that opportunity. So in that sense, they'd been taken away in God's judgment because of disbelief, and they were still in disbelief, so still officially, I think, under God's judgment, simply because they hadn't gone back to the land yet. So that's where Esther happens. It happens to a people that was under judgment, that wasn't really following all of God's commands and taking advantage of God's opportunities. Nevertheless, here God's hand of providence and hand of protection is on them and sees them through, even though that these people are not entirely in obedience. That's what I see here, is that even, and that gives me hope, simply because I know I'm not always in obedience, yet God is faithful and carries through his promises. That's what I see in the book of Esther.
And if Esther hadn't have happened and preserved the people, we wouldn't have had Nehemiah or Ezra or any of the people, the Jewish people, that could have gone back and rebuilt Jerusalem and finished the temple. So yeah, we again, as you've pointed out many times, God's providence and God's preservation, God's hand is on his people to protect them.
So a few things, as we usually do, to try to show that this book is true, that it's accurate history and that it flows along with the true history in the world. It's not just a religious book written for a religious myth. No, this is a historical account that actually happened in history. There's several things in this book to kind of give us evidence for that. One is it mentions this Persian king that our text calls Ahasuerus. Some of the other English translations use the word Xerxes, same person, just which language you're translating from. And so that's an actual person from history that we know existed, and we know that this person in the context fits together well. The author mentions this man Mordecai, then that in Esther 9:20, Mordecai wrote some of these accounts down. So it makes the claim that Mordecai was in a position to have written the record of Esther. We also see several times in this book that it mentions specific years and specific months to date the events in the book. So it talks about the year of the king and things like that. Also, if we just look in the clues, the incidental clues that are scattered throughout the book, we see good double handful of things that tell us that this was actually written by an eyewitness in Persia in the time of 486 to 465 BC. Namely, he uses the correct note that the Persian Empire at this time goes from Ethiopia to India. That's true and accurate history. The architecture that's described in the palace and the king's court aligns with what we know from secular history. The rules of etiquette in the royal palace is mentioned here, what things were allowed and what things were not allowed. That falls in with what we know from secular history. The names are given of specific eunuchs that are helping in the palace. The talks about how the royal history was documented. It talks about these historical records that were put there, and all that aligns with what we know. It gives plots and schemes of people in the background that were trying to have secret plots to kind of take over, and that's recorded here. Chapter 6, verse 8 says that royal horses would have had a royal crest on their head, and that's corroborated by history. So there's these incidental details that when you add them together, this is not just some fuzzy nebulous story that's got a religious moral to it. No. This is enough clues in there to where we know this is accurate history. And on top of that, Jewish tradition, which if the Jews don't know, then no one knows. And Jewish tradition says that Mordecai wrote it. So we have here an eyewitness account that all of the clues we have say that it was written by an eyewitness that was in the Persian court of a known king at the time that it says it was, and we have no evidence to say otherwise. So we're going to take this as God's revealed word, and that's what it really tells us here. Esther shows that there have been people in all ages. Here's another takeaway, Steve. This book of Esther tells us that there have been people in all ages, in all generations, that hate the Jewish people. That hate the Jewish people, because that's the only reason here they're doing this is the Jews are hated and they're tried to be annihilated. And that has happened in virtually all countries and all generations, even down to our present day. We have people that hate the Jews. And so I just leave it with this in the end of this opening. No Christian should fall into a camp of hating the Jewish people. Jewish people, yes, most of them are lost. Some of them believe in Christ. Many of them are lost. We should view them as people that are made in the image of God, that we have a divine command from our Lord to go evangelize. And so that's how we should view the Jewish people today. There should be no Jew hating in the Christian church. And so that's what we have.
You know, Glenn, you mentioned a while ago that there's this thought or theology that God is through with the Jewish people because they're in rebellion. And unfortunately, that was picked up during the 1100s and into the Reformation. But in the 1100s, during the Crusades, to go back, from the Europeans to go back and retake the Holy Land, this idea, this theology that God was through with the Jews, as the Crusaders went back through Europe to go back to the Holy Land, they slaughtered many, many Jews. And then, of course, there was the Spanish Inquisition and things that took place in Europe during that time that came from this theology of that God is through with them. And that's done great, great damage today, to where the Jewish people today really don't want to talk about Christians because they remember the bad things that the people acted upon under the Christian name. And so it's really hard in many cases to reach out for Christians to reach out to Jewish people. And God preserved them during those times in Europe and throughout that era, all the way up until the days today. And so to me, it's a very dangerous theology to come up and say God is through with the Jewish people and we don't want to have anything to do with them. That's it's been a bad in the past, and we need to be careful going forward. You and I hold that God still has something with the Jewish people, and that we should not get in the way of God's plan. We should let God work his plan out but we love the Jewish people, even though they're in rebellion, just like other pagan nations are in rebellion. We still love them. We want them all to come to Christ.
It's interesting that the Jews sometimes have a better memory than we do. The Jews have a better memory than the church does because they remember when the church persecuted them. And as you said, it gets in the way of evangelism now. So the last thing we want to do is kind of make that worse. At the very least, I think all Christians would agree that Jewish people are made in the image of God, and we should view them as a mission field. And if we truly follow the word of God, then we're going to know that his divine hand of providence and his divine hand of protection is going to be on his church as well as the Jewish nation. So with that, we'll stop for today. We'll get into the verse by verse study next time as we reason through the Bible, and we trust that you'll be here to do so with us as well.
Thank you for watching and listening. May God bless you.